The first time the discovery was made, the workers froze. The air was thick with the smell of ice, decay, and secrets long buried. Beneath the worn floorboards of the old slave cabins, they unearthed something that would shatter the narrative of a land built on blood and obedience. 33 tiny bodies, arranged with an almost ritual precision. White babies, pale and fragile, each with eyes the color of a stormy sky, icy blue, staring up at a world that had denied them life, yet somehow demanded silence. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is a record of the kind of cruelty we do not like to confront, because it threatens the stories we tell ourselves about power, morality, and control. In those blue eyes was a secret that the owners of the land, the architects of the system, wanted buried deeper than the bodies themselves, the proof that manipulation, exploitation, and unnatural hierarchies were not just economic. They were engineered, calculated, and carried out with deliberate intent. The plantation where this happened was not an ordinary one. It was a laboratory of human behavior, a place where obedience and subjugation were tested like formulas on a blackboard. The enslaved adults who survived whispered of strange rituals, of children taken for reasons no one dared speak aloud, of a science of fear that had nothing to do with crops and everything to do with control. The masters had power, yes, but the real force they wielded was psychological, the ability to convince generations of human beings that they had no choice, no hope, no claim to the truth that existed right under their noses. And yet, beneath the soil, the earth remembered. The tiny hands, the small skulls, the hollow eyes. They were reminders of what happens when power is left unchecked, when systems are allowed to experiment with life itself, when morality is subordinated to ambition. These infants were not anomalies. They were warnings, signals, encoded messages from a past that was desperate to speak, if anyone had the courage to listen. By the time the discovery made the local papers, the plantation had already tried to sanitize the truth, burying the report beneath euphemisms and official lies. But as we explore what really happened, you will understand something the historians may never admit. The horror was not in the number of bodies, nor in the innocents stolen. It was in the system that made such things not only possible but invisible. If you are willing to descend with me, to leave behind the comfort of ignorance, then listen closely. The world they created is still here. The rules, the manipulations, the power structures, they did not vanish with the blue-eyed children. They evolved. And tonight, I will show you the machinery of control that history has fought to hide, the truths designed to keep men obedient, compliant, and unaware. The plantation itself was a fortress of illusion. From the outside, it appeared orderly, prosperous, a testament to hard work and discipline. But beneath the facade was a network of secrets, designed to control not only bodies but minds. Every cabin, every path, every ritualized punishment was calculated to instill submission, to teach lessons of obedience without ever needing to speak them aloud. Fear was not only a tool, it was a language. And the blue-eyed children buried beneath the cabins? They were the silent punctuation to a sentence meant to last generations. Those who worked the fields learned quickly to obey without question, to internalize the hierarchy so completely that it became a part of them. Every glance from a master, every crack of a whip, every whispered threat was designed to reinforce the narrative. Your life is not your own. But control doesn't end with obedience. It extends to perception itself. The enslaved adults who survived spoke of nights when the masters watched, not for theft or rebellion, but for signs of thought, an eyelid twitch, a hesitating hand, a questioning glance. Thought itself was dangerous. Independent reasoning was a crime. Awareness, a threat. The buried infants were part of this system. Each child was a signal, an experiment, a message etched into the soil. We can shape life. We can claim it. We can take it before it knows itself. No one had written about it openly. Scholars preferred abstraction, euphemisms, and numbers. But anyone who looked closely, who dared to follow the faintest trails of truth, saw the pattern. These deaths were deliberate, connected, and systematic. The blue eyes were no accident. They were markers, a reminder of what the masters deemed superior or worthy of manipulation. And this is where history and horror intersect. The plantation was not only a site of labor, it was a laboratory of psychological control. Adults were broken through routine, ritual, and spectacle. Children were raised to teach obedience. The very soil absorbed the lessons. The system worked not through physical domination alone, but through the systematic annihilation of hope, lineage, and the possibility of independent thought. It was an architecture of compliance. You must understand this. The horror of what they found is not limited to the safest shock of 33 blue-eyed infants. The true terror is in the machinery behind it. The system that created these deaths still exists in shadows, in power structures, in invisible rules. And if you are willing to follow me further, we will see exactly how these mechanisms evolved, and how the invisible control systems of the past shaped the way men think and obey today. The deeper you dig into this history, the clearer the design becomes. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't negligence. It was precision. The blue-eyed children were evidence of a system that valued certain traits, manipulated biology, and tested obedience, not just of the enslaved adults, but of the entire social structure. Each child buried beneath the cabins was both a secret and a statement, a message from those in power to anyone who dared notice that they could play God, and the consequences of awareness were fatal. Think about it. These were infants, incapable of defiance, whose lives were extinguished before they could even speak. And yet, their deaths were meant to teach lessons far beyond infancy. The adults who witnessed, who suspected, who survived, the terror etched into their memories was a psychological tool. It wasn't only fear of immediate punishment. It was fear embedded in narrative. The narrative whispered, life is controlled. Your body, your mind, your very lineage is subject to those above you. Control extended beyond the whip, beyond the cabin, beyond the field. It seeped into thought, perception, and identity. The plantation masters understood something fundamental that history often forgets. The most potent control is invisible. You don't need to strike a man to dominate him. You need to convince him that resistance is not an option, that even awareness is dangerous. The cabins, the graves, the rituals, they were all part of this architecture of obedience. The dead babies were the ultimate signal that the rules of survival and power were dictated entirely by the elite, and that deviation from those rules carried consequences that could reach even the innocent. And yet, even in the shadow of such calculated cruelty, awareness persisted. Whispers of the infants, hints of what was happening beneath the soil, passed from generation to generation, coded in stories, gestures, and quiet acts of defiance. This is the hidden truth. Systems built on terror leave traces. They cannot fully erase consciousness, curiosity, or resistance. The soil may bury bodies, but it cannot bury memory, and it cannot fully suppress understanding. If you are listening carefully, this is where the lesson begins to touch you. Power is rarely brute force alone. The true mastery of control is subtle, invisible, and psychological. It is in shaping perception, dictating narrative, and engineering obedience. And tonight, as we descend further into the story of those 33 blue-eyed children, you will start to see the lines connecting that forgotten horror to every system of hidden power that still exists today. Look closely, because this is where most people turn away. What happened on that plantation was not a historical anomaly. It was an experiment in power, a blueprint for manipulation that stretches far beyond the 1830s. The adults forced to wake, to live, to obey. They were subjects in a social laboratory, conditioned to accept the impossible as inevitable. Every rule, every punishment, every ritualized act of cruelty was a lesson in submission. And the buried children, they were the invisible footnotes, proof of the lengths those in power would go to maintain control. Control is never just physical. That is the mistake most make when they study tyranny superficially. True dominance is psychological. It is about shaping perception, bending identity, and erasing the possibility of resistance before it even emerges. The infants beneath the cabins were a symbol. Life itself is subordinate to the system, to the narrative, to the unseen hierarchy. The adults learned this lesson instinctively, silently, every day. Their obedience was not a choice. It was the only survival mechanism they could trust. And consider this, the masters didn't merely enforce rules. They curated an ecosystem of fae. They monitored interactions, measured reactions, and adjusted punishments to achieve maximum psychological effect. Every glance of a mother toward her child, every whispered warning in the night, was observed. Every small act of defiance became data. The infants, with their uncanny blue eyes, were as much a study as a tragedy. The masters were cataloging the impact of life, death, and fear on human behavior, observing how authority could shape not just action, but thought itself. The most dangerous systems are those you cannot see. Physical chains can be broken, walls can be torn down, but the invisible chains, the ones that dictate perception, obedience, and self-worth, these endure long after the bodies are gone. Those 33 children were raised to send a signal. Your life, your mind, your future belongs to the system. And the people who survived, who absorbed this lesson, carried it with them quietly, knowing that even thinking independently could cost everything. Now, here's the point most will never understand. The terror, the control, the manipulation. It didn't end with slavery. The lessons of the barn, the cabin, the buried children, extend into the way modern systems shape behavior, enforce compliance, and conceal the truth. And if you are willing to go further, to see the world as it really operates beneath the surface, you will recognize the same patterns today. Obedience engineered, perception controlled, and the human mind exploited without our consent. The discovery of the infants forced a reckoning with a truth most prefer to ignore. Power thrives not in the open, but in shadows. The buried children were proof that authority does not merely punish. It engineers, it predicts, it manipulates. The plantation was a controlled ecosystem, a place where life, death, and fear were variables in an equation designed to maintain dominance. Every adult forced to witness or sense the presence of the dead carried the lesson in silence. Question, and the cost is ultimate. Control works best when invisible. Chains, whips, and punishments are only tools. The real machinery of tyranny lies in perception. The enslaved were taught from the first day to internalize the system's narrative, to see themselves as naturally inferior, naturally compliant. Every glance from a master reinforced this. Every ritualized act of violence drilled it deeper. And beneath it all, the infants buried under the cabins whispered the ultimate lesson. Life itself can be stolen, and no one, not even the innocent, escapes the hand of power. Yet even in this meticulously maintained oppression, cracks existed. Awareness is not easily contained. Some adults noticed patterns, remembered inconsistencies, and began to question. It was in these moments, imperceptible to the oppressors, that the seeds of mental resistance were planted. The blue-eyed children, though silent in death, became symbols of this resistance, reminders that the system, as absolute as it appeared, could never fully dominate perception, thought, or the human instinct for survival. Power does not seek only obedience, it seeks identity. The plantation's rules were designed to shape not just actions but beliefs, self-worth, and understanding of the world. They trained the enslaved to accept a preordained life as natural, to internalize their place in the hierarchy without rebellion. The buried infants were a grim punctuation to this lesson, not just punishment, but conditioning on a genetic and psychological scale. The act communicated to all who survived that deviation could not only cost you life, it could erase the future entirely. And here lies the terrifying truth. The architecture of control witnessed in that plantation mirrors systems that exist today. Institutions, governments, corporations, religions, and social hierarchies often operate on the same principles: invisible manipulation, engineered obedience, and psychological conditioning. Those who understand this see the threads, the patterns, and the way compliance is cultivated without violence, through perception, belief, and control of narrative. The buried children were a warning, a message hidden in plain sight. The adults who survived learned it and carried it in silence. And now, as we descend further into the hidden mechanics of power, you will start to see the same patterns around you. The real question is whether you notice, and whether you have the courage to awaken. The barn, the cabins, the graves, they were all part of a network designed to enforce more than labor. They enforced submission of the mind. The masters understood a principle that remains true today. The human psyche can be disciplined more effectively than the body. Fear works as a teacher, but the ultimate tool is invisibility, structuring rules, rituals, and environments so that compliance becomes internalized, almost automatic. Obedience does not require constant violence if the mind believes there is no alternative. The blue-eyed infants, buried beneath the floorboards, were a lesson in extremity. Life can be taken silently, removed from the narrative, erased without acknowledgement, yet their absence communicated volumes. Every adult forced to watch, and obey learned that even when no one sees, the system watches. Every act of resistance, every flicker of awareness, could be punished indirectly, measured, recorded in memory. This is the genius and the horror of psychological control. Survival under such systems depends on more than endurance. It depends on understanding. Those who survive long enough begin to read the signals, the unspoken rules, the rituals, the subtle hierarchies. They learn what is safe to notice, what is dangerous to consider, and how perception itself can be a weapon. And the master, oblivious to the depths of mental awareness, often underestimates those he believes he dominates. This is the vulnerability of any system built on fear alone. It relies on ignorance. And the planted fear is cumulative. It spans generations. The adults who witnessed or suspected the deaths internalized it, then taught the next generation, through stories, warnings, and ritualized compliance, how to survive. The invisible hand of power extended far beyond immediate observation. It became embedded in culture, in memory, in the architecture of obedience itself. This is what most people miss when they study history superficially. The horror of slavery, tyranny, or systemic oppression is not limited to physical brutality. The true weapon is control of perception, the conditioning of thought, the shaping of identity. And once the system achieves that, even knowledge of injustice is not enough to break it. Resistance requires more than courage. It requires awareness, strategy, and the recognition that control is largely psychological. And now, as we descend further, you must prepare to see connections that most refuse to acknowledge, how the same mechanisms of control, manipulation, and invisibility are at work today, in ways far subtler but no less effective than whips and chains. The buried children are only the beginning. The patterns become clearer the closer you examine them. Hierarchies that appear natural are often engineered. Fear masquerades as inevitability. Rituals of power, once thought symbolic, are precise exercises in control. The blue-eyed infants were an extreme example, a direct intervention in life, demonstrating ultimate authority. But the principle extends to every system of dominance. Authority seeks not only obedience, but perception, the belief that the system is real, immovable, and unchallengeable. Those who maintained the plantation understood human psychology at a level most ignore. Punishments were calibrated not to destroy, but to teach. Compliance was rewarded with a false sense of security, while subtle deviations were recorded, remembered, and used to instill caution. Life itself became the medium for training. Each action, each decision, each thought had consequences. The buried children were the most brutal example of this, a signal that even life itself could be manipulated to maintain the illusion of absolute power. And here's the key lesson they never tell you. Power is always more sophisticated than violence alone. A system that relies solely on force can be resisted, can collapse under rebellion. But a system that shapes perception, belief, and identity is nearly invincible. You may obey without realizing it, internalizing the rules, the hierarchy, the narrative of control, until your mind itself becomes the cage. The adults who lived on that plantation understood this intuitively. They obeyed, survived, and learned the patterns of manipulation, how to appear compliant while protecting their awareness, how to navigate the invisible rules, how to read threats before they materialized. Every glance, every gesture, every ritual reinforced the architecture of control. And every burial, every unspoken secret, every erased life carried the invisible weight of authority, teaching lessons the whip could not. The terrifying truth you must understand is this: the mechanics of obedience and control are timeless. They survive empires, revolutions, and centuries. They adapt, hide, and endure. The blue-eyed infants buried beneath those cabins were victims, yes, but they were also the proof that mastery over life and perception has long been the most potent form of power. And now, we descend further, into the systems that remain, the manipulations that persist, and the lessons that, once internalized, cannot be unseen. Awareness, once awakened, is a dangerous thing, for those who seek to dominate, and for anyone who dares to resist. The plantation was a theater, and everyone within it, alive or buried, was part of a carefully choreographed performance. Every cabin, every field, every shadow served a function. The adults who worked there were actors trained through fear, ritual, and observation. The buried infants were the punctuation marks, reminders of the stakes of the performance, symbols of ultimate authority exercised silently, invisibly, but with devastating effect. Their blue eyes, unblinking even in death, carried a message. Control reaches beyond life itself, into perception, into memory, into the soul. The masters understood this instinctively. Violence alone achieves compliance. Psychological control achieves obedience that persists. Every act of punishment, every ritual, every whispered warning was designed to cultivate fear. Yes, but also to shape the way the enslaved saw the world, and themselves. Fear teaches, observation molds, and the subtle lessons of the dead were the most powerful of all. The buried children were invisible teachers, imparting knowledge of power without saying a word, embedding lessons into the very fabric of daily existence. And yet, even amidst this oppressive engineering, awareness flickered. Some adults noticed patterns, understood subtle manipulations, and began to internalize strategies for survival. They learned which gestures invited punishment, which silence protected them, which moments of insight could be trusted. The children, though silenced, became markers for perception. The knowledge of their lives and death circulated in whispers, in glances, in the coded behaviors that sustained mental freedom. Control was never complete. It could be challenged in the mind, and that was terrifying for the oppressors. The plantation's architecture of obedience relied on subtle terror. A glance, a ritual, a threat of disappearance. Every person was taught that deviation, even thought itself, had consequences. The buried infants were the most extreme reinforcement of this lesson. That authority can intervene at the origin of life, that compliance is mandatory before it even becomes choice, and that fear can be a generational force. And yet, paradoxically, the very extremity of the deaths allowed resistance to grow in invisible ways. The mind of the observer, once awakened, becomes impossible to fully dominate. If you are following this path closely, you must begin to see the patterns, the mechanics of psychological control, the manipulation of perception, and the use of invisible signals as a method of dominance. These are not just historical, they are present. The lessons of 33 blue-eyed infants buried beneath the slave cabins echo today in hierarchies, institutions, and systems designed to condition behavior without leaving visible chains. This is the quiet terror that history teaches us. True power resides not in brute force, but in shaping what people see, what they believe, and ultimately, what they feel powerless to resist. The adults who survived the plantation understood the machinery of control better than the masters themselves. They had been immersed in it, studied it silently, and adapted. Compliance was necessary for survival, but observation became a weapon. Every ritual, every punishment, every whispered threat was catalogued, remembered, and reproposed in the mind of those forced to obey. The buried infants, though silent, became the ultimate teacher, instructing the living in the rules of power and obedience with horrifying clarity. Power is not simple. It is laid, subtle, and adaptive. The blue-eyed children were not anomalies. They were symbols of a systematic strategy to dominate bodies, minds, and futures. Fear had limits. Obedience without perception was fragile. To maintain control, the masters relied on an invisible architecture of manipulation, psychological conditioning, spatial arrangement, ritual enforcement, and the constant presence of mortality. Each death, each disappearance, each secret served as reinforcement. And the terrifying brilliance of it is that it works without constant violence. Fear becomes internalized. Awareness itself is conditioned. The adults learn to police themselves, to anticipate punishment before it comes, to adjust behavior before a command is issued. The blue-eyed infants were a stark reminder that the consequences of deviation are absolute, and yet the lessons they imparted could not be entirely erased. Awareness cannot be killed, only temporarily obscured. Think about the implications. Control is more durable when invisibility, perception, and psychological manipulation replace brute force. The most dangerous tyrannies are the ones that condition thought, embed obedience, and shape identity without the need for open conflict. The buried infants were part of this mechanism, demonstrating ultimate authority in a form that could not be resisted directly, only internalized, feared, and remembered. And here's where most stop listening. The same mechanics are operating in your world today. Systems of control evolve, adapt, and survive. Authority no longer needs whips or chains. It exists in suggestion, in ritual, in the subtle shaping of perception. Those who notice, who awaken, are rare. And for those who are awake, the lesson is clear. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward mastery over them. The plantation's hidden truths extend beyond the adults who lived and the infants who died. They reveal something fundamental about human nature, power, and compliance. Systems do not merely dominate the body, they dominate thought, identity, and awareness. The adults who survived learned to read the signs, anticipate punishment, and internalize obedience while silently cultivating awareness. The children, in their deaths, became the most extreme instrument of control, a psychological anchor that reinforced the illusion of omnipotent authority. The blue eyes of the infants were almost symbolic, markers of purity corrupted, of potential snuffed before it could breathe. Every adult who worked, watched, and survived understood what that meant. Compliance is not just expected, it is demanded before life itself is fully realized. Authority was not just a matter of rules, it was a system of conditioning, embedded in every action, every structure, every shadow. And even in the extremity of this system, cracks appeared. Awareness persisted. Observation survived. And in those spaces, the seeds of resistance, mental freedom, and eventual understanding took root. Psychological control is an art perfected over centuries. Physical coercion has limitations, but the control of perception, the shaping of thought, and the engineering of obedience create a force nearly impossible to resist. The plantation exemplified this, a network of fear, ritual, and observation so complete that even those who survived carried the lessons in their very being. And the infants, they were the ultimate demonstration that life, compliance, and perception could all be manipulated with calculated precision. Here is a principle rarely acknowledged. Tyranny is most effective when invisible. People obey willingly when they believe there is no alternative, when every action is observed, every thought anticipated, every deviation punished, sometimes indirectly, sometimes silently, sometimes through the erasure of the innocent. The blue-eyed infants were the extreme case of this principle, but the concept underpins every system of power that survives across generations. And now, as you listen, understand this. The mechanisms that buried these children in secrecy are not gone. They have evolved, hidden in modern systems, in hierarchies, in unseen structures that shape compliance without chains. Observing, understanding, and recognizing these patterns is the first step toward awakening. And if you do not awaken, you remain part of the system, unconsciously submitting, even today. By the second day after the discovery, the local community was trembling, not from superstition, but from the weight of understanding what had been hidden. 33 infants buried beneath the cabins were not just a moral atrocity. They were proof of a deliberate system, engineered to maintain absolute dominance. Every adult who survived the plantation understood this truth instinctively. They had been trained to obey, yes, but they had also learned to see, to anticipate, and to internalize the rules that govern not only survival but the very perception of reality. The blue eyes of the infants became symbols, whispered about in hushed tones. Their deaths were not random. They were markers, data points, and warnings. The adults could not confront this openly, but they could observe, analyze, and survive. And in observing, they gained a subtle form of power, knowledge. Knowledge is dangerous in the eyes of the oppressor. For the master, awareness is a threat, and in that silent understanding, the enslaved began reclaiming control over their own perception. You must grasp this. Systems of dominance rely on invisibility. Violence is easy to see. Psychological manipulation is invisible, insidious, and enduring. The infants were a demonstration of ultimate authority. Life can be claimed before it even begins. Control does not end with physical subjugation. It extends into consciousness, identity, and anticipation. The surviving adults carried these lessons in silence, learning when to speak, when to move, and how to protect what little mental sovereignty they had left. And yet, despite the extremity of these methods, cracks persisted. Awareness is a natural resistance, a force that cannot be fully eradicated. Observation, memory, and thought provided a clandestine rebellion against the system. Each adult who noticed the patterns, who understood the subtle manipulations, was taking the first step toward autonomy, mental freedom, and survival beyond mere compliance. The buried infants were teachers of terror, but the lessons could also cultivate insight and foresight. Now, let me be clear, the terror of those blue-eyed infants is not contained in the past. The same principles of control, fear, and psychological dominance exist in subtle forms all around you today. Power often works invisibly, shaping thought, perception, and identity, rather than relying on brute force alone. Those who recognized these patterns gained the ability to resist, to navigate, and to awaken in a world designed for compliance. And tonight, as we descend further, you will see exactly how these hidden forces operate, and why awareness is the only weapon that truly matters. The system behind those graves was meticulous. Every structure on the plantation, the cabins, the fields, even the walkways, was part of an architecture designed to teach obedience. Authority did not rely solely on punishment. It relied on anticipation, calculation, and the subtle shaping of perception. The adults who survived learned quickly. Obedience must be internalized before it can be externalized. Every glance from the master, every command, every ritualized act of violence was a lesson in submission, and those blue-eyed infants were the ultimate lesson, a silent but absolute testament to the consequences of disobedience or awareness. What is terrifying is the subtlety of this power. The slaves were never free from observation. Every gesture, every pause, every expression was catalogued and analyzed, teaching the observer that deviation was punished, even indirectly. Life itself became a system of reinforcement, and the buried children exemplified the extreme of that reinforcement. Their deaths conveyed an omnipresent authority. Even the innocent are subject to control. And yet, this is where the paradox emerges. Awareness is a natural counter to control. Those who observed, remembered, and calculated began to reclaim agency in subtle ways. They learned how to survive mentally even while physically constrained. The blue-eyed infants, though silent, had imparted the most critical lesson. Authority is strongest over the unobservant mind, and the moment you see clearly, dominance begins to falter. Here's where history intersects with psychology. Tyranny does not only manipulate bodies, it shapes thought, belief, and perception. The architecture of control persists far beyond the immediate act of cruelty. The adults, carrying the memory of the infants, internalized the rules of the system, but they also developed the capacity for understanding, for anticipation, for subtle resistance. They became scholars of survival, even under the harshest oppression. And now, listen carefully. The same forces are active today in systems that condition obedience without visible chains. The methods have evolved, become subtler, more invisible, but the principles remain. Fear is internalized, perception is controlled, and compliance is cultivated. Those who understand this are awake. Those who do not remain prisoners of the system. And as we descend further, I want you to prepare to engage, not passively, but actively. Comment Blue Eyes Awaken twice below if you are ready to see the hidden truths that will change how you perceive authority forever. The reaction of the community was fear. Yes, but also fascination. 33 infants, pale and blue-eyed, buried beneath slave cabins, revealed a secret so terrifying that it challenged the foundations of morality, power, and history itself. This was not an accident of cruelty. It was deliberate, calculated, and systematic. Every adult who survived understood that these deaths were not just tragedies. They were messages designed to teach obedience, suppress thought, and communicate the ultimate reach of control. The system worked like a machine. Observation, ritual, hierarchy, and fear all fed into one another, creating a feedback loop of obedience. The adults became conditioned to expect punishment, internalizing rules before they were enforced. The infants were the extreme reinforcement of this principle. Even life itself could be manipulated to enforce submission. And yet, awareness persisted. Observation survived. And in the quiet, subtle acts of cognition and reflection, the enslaved found mental sovereignty. Psychological control is far more sophisticated than physical dominance. It shapes perception, dictates belief, and engineers obedience without visible coercion. The buried children were the most horrifying example, but the principle extends across centuries and systems. Fear without awareness is temporary. Obedience without perception is fragile. The adults who survived learned to navigate these invisible rules, quietly resisting the domination imposed upon them. Every glance, every whispered word, every subtle signal became a lesson in power and compliance. The adults observed patterns, internalized them, and learned the unspoken language of survival. The buried infants were silent teachers, reminders that the system could reach into life itself, yet unable to destroy cognition, awareness, and the capacity for insight. Awareness became a form of resistance, and resistance, though quiet, undermined authority in ways the oppressors could never fully anticipate. And this is the lesson that extends into the modern world. Systems of control are most potent when invisible, shaping thought, perception, and identity rather than relying solely on force. The mechanisms that buried these children in secrecy are not gone. They have evolved, hidden in institutions, hierarchies, and unseen structures. Those who see, who awaken, gain freedom. Those who do not remain in chains of perception. And now, as we descend deeper, the real truths behind power, manipulation, and compliance will be revealed. The plantation's hidden architecture was meticulous. Every cabin, every pathway, every ritual served as an invisible lesson in hierarchy, fear, and obedience. The adults learned quickly that life depended not only on strength but on perception. Obedience was necessary, but so was understanding. The blue-eyed infants. Buried beneath the cabins were the most extreme signals in this system. They were silent warnings that authority could intervene at the origin of life itself. They were proof that compliance must begin before life is even fully realized. Consider the psychological implications. When obedience is enforced through observation rather than brute force alone, compliance becomes internalized. People learn to police themselves, to anticipate punishment before it arrives, to adjust behavior before a command is given. Fear becomes automatic, identity becomes conditioned, and perception itself bends toward survival. The buried children, though invisible to the casual observer, reinforced the omnipotence of the system. They were a tool of conditioning more potent than any whip, more lasting than any chain. And yet, in the quiet, subtle spaces of awareness, resistance flickered. The adults who survived observed patterns, noted inconsistencies, and learned to navigate the architecture of control. Each glance, each whispered warning, each act of subtle defiance became a way to reclaim perception. The infants, though dead, had imparted a crucial lesson. Authority is strongest over the unaware mind. Once observation and awareness awaken, dominance begins to falter. This is the core principle of hidden power systems, and it extends beyond history into the present day. Control is no longer dependent solely on physical coercion. It thrives in shaping perception, dictating belief, and engineering compliance invisibly. Those who understand this see the structures, anticipate the manipulation, and navigate them with strategic awareness. Those who do not remain trapped, unaware, and obedient, even when chains are gone. And here is the critical truth. The horrors buried beneath that soil were not only acts of cruelty. They were experiments in control, tests in obedience, and exercises in shaping human perception. The blue-eyed infants were a chilling demonstration of ultimate authority, and the adults who survived became living records of this psychological engineering. Awareness is a weapon, knowledge is freedom, and perception is the battlefield where real power is fought and claimed. The deeper the study, the more disturbing the implications. Authority does not simply enforce rules, it engineers reality. The plantation was more than a workplace, it was a system designed to shape minds. Every adult who lived there absorbed the lessons of the environment, the patterns of dominance, and the invisible punishments that kept them compliant. And the blue-eyed infants buried beneath the cabins? They were both victims and instruments, a message written in the language of life and death, communicating the absolute reach of control. Psychological dominance is far more enduring than physical. When perception is shaped, thought is conditioned, and obedience becomes internalized, the individual becomes a participant in their own subjugation. Fear is internalized as reality. The adults adapted, not by confronting the system openly, but by learning its patterns, its rhythms, its hidden rules. The infants, though erased from life, became symbolic anchors, reinforcing compliance and shaping perception in ways invisible to the oppressors themselves. And here's the crucial point. Systems of control thrive when they are unseen. Brute force is temporary. Threats of death are limited. But when identity, awareness, and perception are manipulated, obedience becomes self-enforced, enduring across generations. The adults learn to navigate the invisible rules, reading subtle cues, anticipating consequences, and internalizing the architecture of power while maintaining a hidden mental autonomy. The buried children were reminders that the ultimate reach of power extends beyond immediate consequences. Authority could intervene in life itself, erase potential before it begins, and maintain dominance through fear and subtle conditioning. Yet awareness cannot be erased. Observation persists. Cognition survives even under the most extreme systems of control. And this is where resistance takes root, not through open rebellion, but through strategic, silent perception. As you listen, consider the modern parallels. Systems today operate on the same principles: compliance engineered, perception shaped, and obedience internalized. The tools have evolved, the methods have become subtler, but the lessons of the blue-eyed infants remain. Awareness is the key to breaking the invisible chains, and once awakened, it cannot be contained. The adults who survived carried invisible scars, but they also carried knowledge. Each subtle act of compliance, every careful observation, every internalized rule became a tool for survival. They learned the invisible language of power, which gestures invite punishment, which silences protect, which observations could be trusted. And though the blue-eyed infants could never speak, they communicated more powerfully than words ever could. They were the ultimate lessons in control, obedience, and the invisible reach of authority. Authority relies not only on the actions it takes, but on the perception it enforces. Control is most potent when compliance is self-imposed. The plantation's architecture of fear trained adults to anticipate consequences, internalize obedience, and bend perception to the will of the masters. The buried infants were an extreme demonstration of this system, the ultimate example of control over life, death, and potential. Their presence beneath the cabins communicated that authority extends beyond the immediate, beyond the visible, and even beyond the living. Yet within this extreme oppression, awareness persisted. Adults observed patterns, noted inconsistencies, and quietly learned to navigate the system without inviting death. They adapted, survived, and preserved mental autonomy. In essence, the system that sought to dominate life itself inadvertently created minds capable of reading, understanding, and resisting control, even if only internally. The infants were tragic, but they were also teachers, proof that knowledge, observation, and awareness survive even when the system seeks to erase them. This principle applies far beyond history. Modern systems of manipulation, whether political, corporate, or social, operate on the same psychological laws: invisibility, perception shaping, and internalized compliance. Chains are no longer visible, but control persists. Authority functions most efficiently when it is unseen and unquestioned. Awareness is the only defense, and recognition is the first step toward freedom. And so the lesson of those blue-eyed infants continues to resonate. Life can be controlled, obedience can be enforced invisibly, but perception cannot be fully dominated. Once the mind awakens, the architecture of control begins to crumble. For those who observe, understand, and act with insight, freedom is always possible, even in the shadows of history's darkest truths. The plantation was more than a place of labor. It was a laboratory of domination. Every act, every subtle manipulation was part of a system designed to control thought as much as behavior. The adults learned quickly. Survival depended not only on compliance but on awareness. Observation became a form of power, even under the weight of fear. And the 33 blue-eyed infants buried beneath the cabins were the ultimate proof of the lengths authority would go to enforce obedience. They were invisible instruments of control, communicating the reach of power beyond life itself. The lesson is simple but horrifying. Control is strongest when it is unseen. Physical punishment can be endured, chains can be broken, but when perception itself is shaped, obedience becomes automatic. The adults understood this instinctively. They learned to anticipate consequences, to read subtle cues, to internalize rules before they were enforced. And yet, awareness persisted, quietly defying the system. The infants, though silent, were constant reminders of the consequences of defiance and the power of perception. Here lies the terrifying paradox of authority. The more extreme the control, the greater the potential for awareness to awaken. Adults who survived studied the patterns, memorized the rituals, and learned to navigate the system without drawing lethal attention. In doing so, they gained a subtle freedom, the knowledge of how power operates, even when that power seems absolute. The infants, in their deaths, became teachers of insight, lessons embedded in soil, memory, and observation. Power rarely relies on force alone. True mastery operates through perception, shaping beliefs and conditioning identity. The buried children represented the apex of this principle, authority intervening at the origin of life to reinforce obedience and instill fear. And yet, paradoxically, such extremes also reveal the system. Awareness grows in the spaces left by terror. Observation becomes resistance. Insight survives even in the shadow of death. Now, take this lesson with you. The principles that buried those infants in secrecy are not confined to history. They persist today in modern systems, corporations, governments, social hierarchies, all structured to manipulate perception, shape identity, and cultivate obedience. The chain may be invisible, but it is no less real. Awareness is your first act of resistance. Recognition is your first step toward freedom. And once you see clearly, once you observe, the illusion of control begins to crumble. The adults who survived were living maps of control, witnesses to the architecture of domination. Every subtle rule, every ritual, every unspoken threat had been internalized, catalogued, and observed. They understood the invisible forces shaping their world. The blue-eyed infants, buried beneath the cabins, were proof that authority could intervene in life itself, enforcing obedience through fear, ritual, and the promise of erasure. Every adult understood the lesson without words. Perception is control, and awareness can be deadly if misapplied. The most insidious power is not brute force. It is invisibility. When obedience is internalized, when thought is conditioned, compliance becomes self-sustaining. The adults learn to navigate these invisible structures, to anticipate punishment, and to survive mentally, even while physically constrained. The infants were extreme examples of authority's reach, but they also revealed a truth the masters could not fully suppress. Knowledge and observation survive, even under the harshest tyranny. History often sanitizes such events, but the principles endure. Control is built not on chains alone, but on perception, identity, and faith. The blue-eyed infants were both victims and instruments, teaching the invisible rules of survival. Adults adapted, observing, calculating, and learning to exist without surrendering awareness. In these hidden strategies, they reclaimed a measure of freedom within the oppressive system, demonstrating the enduring resilience of cognition. Authority operates through subtlety, shaping what people believe is possible, safe, or inevitable. The buried children were proof that control extends beyond life, beyond the immediate, and even beyond visibility. The lesson for the observer, the survivor, and the aware is this: true power resides in perception, and once awakened, awareness is indestructible. Now, consider the systems that surround you today. The mechanisms that buried these infants may have evolved, but they persist in modern hierarchies, institutions, and invisible forces shaping obedience and compliance. Observation, insight, and awareness are your weapons. And if you have the courage to see clearly, the chains that once seemed invisible begin to lose their grip. The hidden architecture of the plantation was psychological, systemic, and ruthless. Every adult who lived there learned to survive not just physically but mentally. Compliance was only half the equation. Observation, understanding, and awareness were the other half. The buried infants were the ultimate lesson in control. Life itself could be claimed, erased, or manipulated, and perception had to bend accordingly. The adults internalized these lessons, learning to navigate without inviting punishment, while cultivating subtle autonomy within the invisible system. Authority relies on more than punishment. It relies on shaping belief, perception, and identity. Compliance becomes automatic when the mind accepts the system as inevitable. The adults understood this instinctively. They observed patterns, memorized rituals, and adapted. The blue-eyed infants, though dead, communicated the reach of power more effectively than words ever could. Life and death were lessons in obedience, perception, and faith. And yet, the paradox of extreme control is awareness. The adults who survived cultivated observation and subtle resistance. They learned to anticipate the system's manipulations, reclaiming mental freedom even while their bodies remained constrained. The buried children, though victims of unimaginable cruelty, imparted a lesson in the endurance of cognition. Awareness cannot be erased, even when life itself can. This principle extends beyond history. Systems of control today are often invisible, subtle, and psychological. Power operates through shaping perception, dictating belief, and engineering compliance. The buried infants were the ultimate manifestation of this principle in action. And the lesson remains: those who awaken, observe, and understand gain freedom. Those who do not remain trapped in invisible chains. You are witnessing the anatomy of control. You are seeing the blueprint of obedience and manipulation, as it was tested on the most vulnerable and now persists in new forms. Awareness is your weapon, Recognition is your liberation. And once the mind awakens, the machinery of control begins to unravel. The adults who survived the plantation were not only witnesses, they were living evidence of a system designed to dominate perception. Every glance, every ritual, every whispered warning had been internalized. They knew instinctively how authority functioned, even when invisible. And the 33 blue-eyed infants buried beneath the cabins were the ultimate manifestation of that power. A silent, unyielding assertion that life itself could be claimed, controlled, and erased if compliance wavered. Their presence reinforced the omnipotence of the system and the fragility of awareness under oppression. Control does not demand constant enforcement. Its true strength lies in invisibility. When thought is conditioned and perception bent, obedience becomes automatic. The adults learned this principle early. Every subtle cue, every silent message, every hidden hierarchy was observed, catalogued, and internalized. The infants were the apex of this system, proof that authority could intervene in existence itself. They were both victims and instruments of a strategy that shaped behavior, perception, and identity simultaneously. And yet, extreme control always carries a paradox. Awareness survives. Even in the most oppressive conditions, cognition persists. Observation becomes a form of resistance. The adults learn to navigate the architecture of fear while cultivating subtle freedom of thought. The infants, though dead, imparted a crucial lesson. Authority cannot fully dominate perception, and knowledge cannot be entirely erased. In surviving, observing, and adapting, they reclaimed mental sovereignty in a system designed to obliterate it. The buried children, and the psychological framework that created their deaths, reveal a timeless principle. The most insidious systems of control are invisible, shaping identity and perception rather than relying solely on force. Those who perceive the mechanisms gain insight and the potential for freedom. Those who remain unaware remain trapped in obedience, sometimes even when the chains have long been removed. The lesson extends beyond the plantation. Modern hierarchies, institutions, and unseen power structures operate on the same principles, shaping perception, internalizing obedience, and conditioning thought. The extreme violence of the past was merely a blueprint for subtler, enduring systems of influence. Awareness is the key to navigating these forces. Recognition is the first step toward liberation. The plantation's design was precise. Its control extended from physical structures to the invisible corridors of perception. The adults who survived internalized lessons in obedience, observation, and anticipation. Every glance, gesture, and ritual reinforced their understanding of the system. And the blue-eyed infants, buried beneath the cabins, were the ultimate reinforcement. Silent testimonies to the reach of authority, evidence that power could intervene at life's inception, erasing potential before it could challenge the hierarchy. The principle is brutal but clear. Control thrives when it is unseen. Violence is temporary. Chains can be broken. But when perception is manipulated, identity shaped, and thought conditioned, obedience becomes self-enforced. Adults learn to anticipate punishment, navigate subtle hierarchies, and internalize rules without needing constant reinforcement. The infants communicated this principle in its purest form. Life itself is subordinate to authority, and perception is the battlefield. Yet, the extreme measures of control contain their own vulnerability. Awareness is persistent. Observation endures. Adults quietly learned patterns, memorized cues, and cultivated subtle autonomy. In surviving, they discovered a truth the masters could not erase. Cognition cannot be destroyed, and awareness provides the first pathway to resistance. The infants, in their deaths, became unlikely teachers of insight, illustrating both the reach of control and the limits of authority. The lessons of this hidden architecture extend far beyond history. Modern systems, corporations, governments, social hierarchies, employ the same principles, shaping perception and engineering compliance without visible coercion. Chains are no longer required when obedience is internalized. Awareness becomes the weapon that breaks the invisible cage. And the moment you see clearly, the machinery of control begins to crumble. You are now entering the deepest layers of the truth. The buried children, the adults who survived, the invisible rules, the architecture of compliance, all point to the same principle. Power is invisible, obedience is internalized, and awareness is the only path to liberation. Every surviving adult on that plantation was a silent scholar of human control. They understood instinctively how to navigate the invisible hierarchy, anticipating punishment, decoding patterns, and protecting perception. The blue-eyed infants buried beneath the cabins were not only victims, they were instruments of authority, demonstrations of power over life itself. Their deaths were lessons embedded in soil, ritual, and memory. Perception can be dominated, life can be claimed, and obedience can be demanded before consciousness fully awakens. The system's brilliance and horror lay in its subtlety. Fear alone could not maintain control. Observation, internalized compliance, and shaping of identity were the true weapons. Adults learned to survive mentally, even as their bodies were constrained. The infants communicated the ultimate lesson. Authority's reach extends beyond the visible, beyond the immediate, even beyond life itself. And yet, resistance is inherent in awareness. The adults observed, remembered, and adapted, reclaiming mental autonomy in subtle, almost invisible ways. The extreme acts of control inadvertently created minds capable of perceiving manipulation and navigating it strategically. The infants were teachers of perception, illustrating both the reach and limits of dominance. These principles extend into modern systems. Control today rarely requires chains or whips. It functions invisibly, shaping thought, perception, and behavior. Authority thrives when obedience is internalized. Awareness is the key to resisting the invisible structures around you. Once perception awakens, dominance falters. The lessons of the blue-eyed infants remain potent. Knowledge, observation, and insight are weapons against invisible tyranny. Now, understand this. History's darkest truths are not relics. They are lessons, blueprints for survival, insight, and mastery over systems designed to dominate thought. Those who awaken see patterns, recognize manipulation, and reclaim agency. Those who do not remain trapped in invisible chains. And in the shadows of this hidden architecture, awareness becomes liberation. The adults who survived understood the architecture of control as a living system. Every subtle ritual, every silent threat, every glance reinforced obedience. The blue-eyed infants buried beneath the cabins were extreme demonstrations of authority's reach, the ultimate lesson that life itself is subordinate to power. And yet, in the quiet spaces of cognition, awareness persisted. Observation became resistance. Insight survived in the minds of those forced to comply. The principle is universal. The most effective control is invisible. Physical punishment is temporary. Chains can be broken. But when perception is manipulated, obedience internalized, and identity conditioned, dominance becomes self-sustaining. The adults observed, memorized, and adapted, reclaiming mental freedom even while physically constrained. The infants, though dead, communicated lessons in perception, compliance, and the limits of authority. Extreme control carries inherent paradox. The more meticulous the manipulation, the more opportunity for awareness to awaken. Adults quietly learned patterns, decoded rituals, and understood the invisible rules. Life and death became teachers, imparting knowledge of power's reach and the resilience of cognition. The buried infants were tragically powerful symbols, reminders of authority's capability and the enduring strength of perception. These lessons apply today. Modern hierarchies, corporations, governments, and social systems employ the same principles invisibly, shaping belief, perception, and behavior. The chains have evolved into subtle conditioning. Observation, insight, and awareness are your weapons. Those who perceive the system gain autonomy. Those who do not remain trapped. And as we approach the final descent, you will see the full scope of how these principles manifest across time, influence, and power. The hidden systems that buried 33 blue-eyed infants beneath slave cabins are not relics, they are templates. Templates for dominance, compliance, and psychological engineering. Adults who survived were not just witnesses, they were silent archivists, learning, observing, and internalizing lessons in perception and obedience. Every glance, every ritual, every act of compliance became a map for navigating the invisible hierarchy of power. Control is strongest when unseen. The adults learned this instinctively. Violence alone cannot dominate perception. The system succeeded because it shaped thought, internalized obedience, and conditioned identity. The infants, though erased, communicated the ultimate lesson. Authority extends beyond the visible, beyond life, into perception itself. And yet, awareness survived. Cognition endured. Observation became resistance. Insight could not be buried, and this is where true power lies, in the mind of the observer. Modern systems continue this pattern. Authority thrives invisibly, shaping belief and conditioning compliance. Chains have been replaced by subtle hierarchies, rituals, and psychological pressure. Awareness is the weapon. Recognition is liberation. Those who awaken see the architecture, understand the rules, and navigate the system strategically. Those who do not remain confined, obedient, and unaware. The blue-eyed infants were the ultimate teachers of perception and control. Their lesson resonates across centuries. True power resides not in violence, but in shaping minds. Observation, awareness, and insight are the only defenses against invisible tyranny. Now, at the end of this descent, understand the magnitude of what you have witnessed. 33 blue-eyed infants buried beneath slave cabins were more than victims. They were instruments of a hidden system, demonstrating the ultimate reach of authority. Adults who survived internalized obedience, mastered perception, and navigated invisible hierarchies. The lessons they carried echo today in the unseen structures of control surrounding us. Power is invisible, obedience is internalized, and perception is the battlefield. Authority thrives when you do not notice it, when your mind unconsciously adapts to rules and patterns. Awareness is the only weapon against these invisible chains. Observation, insight, and understanding are the tools of liberation. The history you have just uncovered is dangerous because it teaches you to see the invisible, to recognize manipulation, and to reclaim agency. Systems of control have evolved, but the principles remain. Perception can be shaped, obedience can be engineered, and cognition can resist. Those who awaken gain freedom. Those who remain unaware remain trapped. Remember the blue-eyed infants. Remember the adults who survived. Their lives, their deaths, and their silent lessons are more than history. They are a blueprint for understanding power, survival, and the unseen forces that shape behavior even today. Comment Blue Eyes Awaken twice to cement this knowledge. Claim your awareness, and step into the understanding few will ever reach. From this point forward, nothing will feel the same, and the invisible structures around you will never be invisible again.